Some of the most common writing advice out there is that authors need to write with an audience in mind. And while many of us will interpret this as serving our audience through our words, it's also important that we serve ourselves, that we write in a way that is satisfying to us and fulfills our needs as creative writers. So, how do we find the balance between writing for our audience and writing for ourselves? I want to talk about that today. Stay tuned. You've got the story, you've got the idea, you just don't know the steps in the process. If this is what's holding your memoir back, I have got the solution for you. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from idea to published marketable book. And you can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist. If you Google, should I write for my audience or myself, you will find tons of contradictory advice. Everyone feels so confident that their side is the right side. In fact, if you keep scrolling down that page of Google results, you'll not only start to see confident answers on one side or the other, you'll start to see articles that are refuting the other side. We are constantly battling this dichotomy in our own minds as writers, and I think that's the wrong take. I want to talk today about how we're going to find the balance between these two perspectives. But I think it's going to be helpful if first we map out the arguments that exist for both sides of this coin. Now, as I kind of indicated earlier, I think both of these are incomplete, but they also are both important factors to consider as you move forward. Okay, so those who say write for yourself, what is the argument? Because of course we don't want to be so self-centered that we're not reaching others, we're not communicating with others, inviting them into our story. So when we talk about writing for the market, what some people will say is if you try to adapt to market trends, you are very, very likely to end up with a cookie cutter book. It's going to read just like every other book out there. And if you try to hit current market trends, by the time your book comes out in 2, 3, 5, 10 years, those trends are very likely to be completely over, if not on their way out. So when we write to the market specifically, we are limiting ourselves. What we're doing is putting our voice aside so that we can meet whatever we are perceiving that the market wants. I get why this is tempting. Oftentimes when we're thinking about writing this book, we know down the pike we're going to be querying, we're going to be trying to get that book contract, or we're going to be self-publishing and trying to market that book to our readers. So it is very, very, very tempting to think about the market first. Okay, but at the same time, we also have to think about the arguments that we might make if we're thinking about writing for ourselves. One of the main ones for me personally is that when I am trying to write to the market, something I really try to avoid doing, but you know what, I'm only human. When I'm trying to write to the market, I will often find myself becoming very cynical and really feeling like I don't have that personal connection to what I'm writing. That for me is the thing that keeps me going, right? I do not want to sit in front of a keyboard every single day to try to please some strangers that I may or may not ever meet, right? I want to write for myself. I want to get that truth out. And particularly if you are watching this channel as a memoir writer, when you're writing your own story, it is profoundly personal, right? It feels even icky to think about the market and how we're going to please the audience as we're trying to work through this trauma or these experiences of surviving something hard or the inspiring story of our life. We really want to think about that as our story, and it can be super, super hard to think about releasing that to the market. So this is why I advocate for balancing the two positions. That yes, you do need to be writing for your audience, but you also do need to write for yourself. And they're both important. And I will tell you, if you start watching this in your own brain as you're writing, you will see yourself slide between these two poles. And there's a point at either end that is going to feel really icky, that is going to signal to you that it is time to pause and regroup. And when you get there, come back to this video because let's talk about some of the mindset shifts that we need to make as we are balancing these two perspectives rather than leaning into one or the other. Okay, so the first thing I want you to think about is promise versus preference. And this is going to be easier to talk through if we think about you as an audience. Of course, you're a writer, but you also read books. And if you don't, you should be. It's going to make you a way better writer. And with all of us, when we are picking out books, reading them, determining what kinds of reviews we want to leave, whether we want to recommend them to friends, we are always operating on two different dimensions: promises and preferences. So, promises, these are the things that are non negotiable for most readers. If, for example, we pick up a thriller, I love a thriller, we expect it to be thrilling, right? We expect a particular type of build. We usually expect particular types of characters or kind of archetypes. We expect there to be kind of some moodiness. We expect a really dramatic climax, right? There are things that, by marketing that book as a thriller, the reader is going to see as a promise that if you do not deliver on that detail, they will be disappointed. It was a promise by means of the genre. Now, thriller is a little bit easier than memoir because we have a huge range of things that can count as memoir, right? But pretty much any time you pick up memoir or really any other narrative nonfiction, you expect to get some type of relatable truth, right? It might be that you feel that you're promised kind of a slice of life. That is a totally fair thing to assume you're going to get in a memoir, right? A piece of someone's true life. You expect it to be nonfiction, which is why we periodically have these scandals of people who wrote memoirs that actually weren't true at all. That is the breaking of a promise in memoir and any nonfiction. And of course, we expect that that story we are going to read is going to center on some particular truth, right? Something that seems totally real, that is going to be kind of explored in a little bit more depth than what we might normally think of. So those are all promises. And if you think about books that you really, really disliked, I bet that there is some promise that that book broke. Whether you thought about it that way or not at the time, typically when we think about a book we really hate, it has to do with a broken promise. Now, on the other side of this coin are our preferences. Now, this one is way, way harder to talk through in general terms because, unlike promises, which tend to be fairly general and universal, when we talk about preferences, we are talking about your individual preferences as a reader. So, are you someone who, when you pick up a memoir, you prefer it to be very genuine, authentic, vulnerable, real? Maybe you like a little tearjerker, maybe you don't mind if there's a little kind of leaning into the sentimentalism or nostalgia. I kind of like that. But you might, on the other side of the fence, be somebody who likes a little sarcasm and humor, that if there is too much kind of genuine authenticity, it feels just dripping sugary sweet to you and you just can't do it. You've got to have some little jabs or jibes or jokes, right? Those are preferences. Now, there's one thing that we always think about when we are pitching memoirs to agents and or publishers, and that is there an established market? And the reason I started the segment by saying it's really helpful to think of yourself as a reader is that yourself as a reader existing establishes that there is a standing market for that type of preference. So the two examples I gave a second ago, the kind of sweet, genuine, nostalgic writing in a memoir, there are lots of people that love that, right? And there also are lots of people that love a little more sarcastic, jokey tone. Both of those markets exist, and more to the point, we know they exist because you are in one or the other or a different one, right? So here's where we come down to rubber meeting the road. When you are thinking about yourself versus your audience, you want to balance both the promise and the preference. When we think about the promise, again, that is non-negotiable, right? Your memoir must be based on truth. Now, in previous videos, I have talked about truth versus facts. That video is absolutely worth revisiting if you haven't seen it. It's called The Promise of Truth in Memoir. But suffice it to say, the most important thing is that when you market a book as nonfiction, it better be nonfiction, right? So we're not going to break that promise. And I want you also to think about what are some of the other promises that you see in the genre of memoir. I typically suggest that you need to have some kind of a story build. Now, not all memoir follows a traditional story structure. That is true. But typically, when we think about memoir that's playing with the convention of narrative storytelling, we usually think about that as being experimental. And by definition, experimental is pushing the limits of those promises, right? So when we're thinking about memoir, it needs to be true. It needs to usually follow some kind of a story structure, and it needs to tell something authentic about you, right? It needs to let us into your internal life. We don't just want a narration of events. We need to know what it means and why it matters. So those are the promises, right? You were probably going to hit those anyway, even if I didn't talk about them in this video. The more complicated part is the preference. Now, the easiest advice here is to remember that you are an established market. You existing as a reader, buying books, prove that there is a market for the type of thing you like that is out there already saleable. Now, when you go into deciding some of these preference issues, things like voice, things like what to include, things like theme, when you go into those, trying to imagine what your audience wants, you will very, very often find that your audience actually wants all kinds of things. Your audience is in part going to be defined by the way you define them. So what I always suggest, what Emily always suggests, is write with your own preferences in mind. Now, this is a big reason actually that we recommend that you are reading memoir all throughout your memoir writing journey. And in fact, you don't even always have to be reading memoir. Reading really any book is going to give you this information. As you are writing, tune into yourself. What do you really like and respect and admire and enjoy when you are reading a book? Do you want some lightness? Is that what you look for in a book? Put that in there. Write with your own preferences in mind and make sure you hit all those promises, and your book will be a hit with your audience. Okay, the second thing I want you to consider after you have worked through promises and preferences is I want you to remember that writing is a process. Books are a product. And the reason this matters is that the answer to should I write for myself or should I write for my audience is often very different depending on what stage you are in. Now, in the memoir method, we have a very specific set of steps that we ask people to take as they move through the development, the outlining stage, the structuring stage of their memoir, into the drafting stage, into the revising stage, and then into those final 2 units that we offer on publishing and marketing. I want to focus just on the first 2 of those, the development and outlining and the drafting, because this is where this confusion is very likely to come in. Now, as we start our pre-writing stage, this is our development and outlining, we always suggest that people start with a brain dump, then they go through their brain dump, they figure out what their core topic and key message, and then use those elements to break down the stories that they brain dumped, figure out the order and arrangement that they go in, what all's included, what isn't, into a skeleton outline, which then they can write into a detailed outline and even get feedback on that. Now, just within this initial development phase, you are going between inward facing, things that you're doing for yourself, and outward facing, things that you are doing for your audience. Let me tell you what I mean. As you are brain dumping all the things you want to put into your book, that is only for you. No one else will ever look at that document, right? So there is no reason that as you are kind of brainstorming, what do I want in here, that you should be thinking about, I need to make sure I write this in a way that will make sense to a stranger on the street. It probably won't, and it doesn't need to, right? When we do that brainstorming phase, I think all of us know, right? That is internally facing. That is just for us. No one else's eyes are needed. Now, this starts to get a little bit more complicated, and I have seen this a lot in the Memoir Method program. When we move into our core topic and our key message, this is often a time that people really want to start thinking about the audience much, much more than they need to. Let me tell you what I mean. So we break down core topic and key message within the Memoir Method. The core topic, simply what your book is about. So this is very, very concrete. My book is about my divorce. My book is about adopting my second kid. Whatever it may be, it is a concrete, observable topic. The other end of this is your key message. This is not concrete and it's usually not observable. What it is the thing that you learned from going through that core topic. And because you learned it, you are going to be able to use your experiences to teach this to your audience. Now, I talked about this in a previous video just a couple of weeks ago, so you can flip back if you want to learn more about the key message. But the point I want to make here is, as you are drafting out your core topic and your key message, you do want to make sure that those two things are going to fulfill the promises of the genre. So in other words, is your core topic something that is applicable to enough people that it is going to be appealing, and or is your message something that carries this kind of universal value of truth, where whether or not folks have been through the exact thing you've been through, there will be something for them to connect to. So we want to make sure that we are hitting the promises in both of those areas. At the same time, as you are drafting your core topic and your key message, this is before you have even started writing, right? You are drafting this really to be your own internal compass, so that as you revisit those two statements, your topic and your message, you are continually able to check in with yourself. Are you writing the book that you set out to write? Are you writing a book whose truth is your truth, what you observed? Are you writing your story in a way that is true to your experience? Because that is not only a promise, it also is something that is so, so important to you being able to move forward with this very daunting, very difficult task that you have set out to do. So when you draft your core topic and your key message, those are for you. They are not for the audience. And in fact, as we very often tell Memoir Method members, no one else will probably ever even see those drafts. Later down the line, you may revisit them. They may be helpful for marketing materials or your query letter, but they are for your eyes. They are inward facing. But as we move into the outlining, we start to get a little more complex. Now, most Memoir Method members will follow our pattern pretty specifically. That involves first a skeleton outline, where you are just listing the scenes that you want to include, playing around with the order, playing around with the pacing, that sort of thing. But as you move on, after you figure out what those scenes are going to be, where your chapter breaks are going to be, what your structure is, what you will then do is write out your detailed outline. Now, this has two purposes. One of them is, if you can write a quick description of every chapter during this developmental stage, you have now given yourself a roadmap to move through that whole book. If you're writing a chapter a week, which is typically doable, you can look at what chapter am I supposed to write this week. That will serve you in chapter 1 and chapter 2, and it will serve you in chapter 18 and chapter 19 when it has been months since you wrote that outline. So as we are writing those little descriptions of each chapter in our detailed outline, we really are writing for ourselves, right? We are setting ourselves up for success as we move through this book. But I mentioned earlier that I always suggest that you get feedback on your detailed outline. So it is this step at which you are going to make this very crucial pivot from thinking only internally to thinking about both yourself and your audience. So what I always recommend is that you draft out your detailed outline, about 100 words per chapter description. Maybe you'll put some bullet points. And then go find someone to read it. Now, a couple of months ago, I did a video on how to get effective feedback, and I'll give you a little insight. That video actually is based on exactly what we teach when we are teaching people to go get feedback on their outlines. And the reason that I want to be very specific here is that there's such a temptation when you're getting feedback on your outline or really any piece of writing to ask people very specific questions. It's very tempting to say, oh, what did you think about that scene where my daughter was born? Or, what did you think about the scene where I got in that big encounter with the guy at the bar? We want to think about these scenes that we are really either attached to or a little bit nervous about, the scenes that are kind of hot buttons for us. I do not recommend that you get that type of feedback. Instead, what you want to do at this point to help make sure you have hit that pivot from internal to external is you want to ask for feedback on your clarity. What I mean is you want to ask that reader just to read it, no context. Do not give them your core topic, do not give them your key message. Just ask them to read through and then ask them to tell you, is this clear? Did you understand what was happening? Did it make sense how one chapter led to the next, to the next, to the next? Were there chapters that seemed really out of place? Were there parts that were confusing? This type of feedback is going to not only help you build a stronger book, it is going to tell you whether you have successfully pivoted into something that will serve your audience. And then, to make matters even more complicated, I then recommend that you turn it back on yourself. Once you have that feedback, this is an excellent opportunity to practice using feedback, external feedback, to serve your internal writing goals. Because guess what? Just because somebody gave you a piece of feedback does not mean you have to incorporate it. I'm going to say that again. Just because someone gives you a piece of feedback does not mean that you need to incorporate it. We come back here to our promises versus preferences. The reason that we are asking our outside feedback reader to tell us whether our outline seems clear is that the promise of any narrative book is a clear narrative, right? When we pick up a piece of narrative nonfiction or a novel, we expect that it will take us through a story, that the steps of the story will make sense, even if there's experimental material in there, that we will be able to follow a basic arc. That is what you are asking your reader, your feedback reader, to give you. Are you following the promises of any narrative book? So that's why we ask for clarity. What you may find, either on your outline or certainly when you get feedback on your full book, is you'll get some feedback on the promises and you'll get some feedback on the preferences. And here is where the feedback that you might not take comes in. Sometimes your reader will give you feedback that is based on their personal preferences. But remember, we are not trying to meet every audience member's personal preferences. Number one, it's impossible. Number two, it's not their book. They can write their own book if they want all their preferences satisfied, right? Remember, when we talked about promise versus preferences, my advice is to follow your own preferences. So, as you get this feedback on your outline, the only adjustments you're going to make are in terms of fulfilling that coherent narrative promise. You may or may not choose to make adjustments based on some of the preference feedback you get. But the most important thing is to remember promises, those are non-negotiable. Preferences, that's anybody's guess. Now, the final thing that I want you to consider as you are working through this dilemma between audience and self is I want you to remember that the purpose is the honesty, not the outcome. The honesty, not the outcome. I have talked many, many times on this channel about the difference between facts and truth in memoir writing. You might remember that the way I like to think about this is that when you write a memoir, you are making an argument about truth. Actually, all narrative nonfiction is making an argument about truth, but that is so crucial to keep in mind when you're writing a memoir. And what I mean by that is that regardless of which facts you include, how much detail you include about those facts, which facts get cut, which facts you can't verify, what matters is the truth. What matters in memoir is that we are taking some piece of our own very personal experience and blowing it up to think about how it reflects not only our experience, but some component of the whole human experience. I like to think about it as an umbrella, that if we can open up our umbrella of truth, we can invite others in. And that is the way you know that your memoir is successful. If other people read it and think, you know what? I have or haven't been through that exact experience, but I do feel deeply this larger human truth that is included in the book. That is the feeling that we want from our readers. Now, I work with a lot of memoir writers who want more than just to tell a compelling story. They want to use their story to change the world. And I love this because stories can and do change the world all the time. This is such a noble goal and it's so important. And I am so glad that people do this because it does make our world a better place. But I bet if you sit down to write and you start thinking about how important it is to you to get this story out so that you can change the world, I bet that's pretty instant writer's block. For most of us, when we try to reflect on this larger outcome we're trying to achieve, the change we want to make in the world, it becomes way, way, way too hard to focus on what our inner voice is telling us. Because when we start thinking about the outcome over the honesty, we have shifted completely to something out of our control, right? Unfortunately, you can write the best memoir that has ever been written, and it may not change the world. That's just a hard truth. But if what you aim for is the honesty to share your personal truth with someone else who needs it, you can achieve that. That does not require external validation of any kind, really. When you write the truth, you have already fulfilled your promise of inviting others into your experience. We've kept that balance when we focus on the honesty. But there's a trap within that honesty too. And what I find is that very often for memoir writers, because we are not only thinking about kind of this grand audience out there, we're thinking about actual people who are going to read this book, many of whom are in that book as characters. What that means is it can be so tempting to just tweak our honesty just a little bit because, that person is not going to like that you said that about them and they're a good person at heart and maybe we should just leave that scene out where they said X or Y or Z or did X or Y or Z. Or conversely, maybe we have somebody in our book that we care about so much, and in tweaking that honesty, we really want to be a little bit more grateful, give a little bit more of a shout out, really put some praise on that person. Because in either case, when that specific person reads the book, we want a particular reaction from them. Again, I say that is external validation. That is not something you can control. And in fact, you can make all the tweaks you want to the truth or the facts or whatever it may be. If a person is not going to like your book, they're not going to like your book. If they're going to feel really good at being mentioned, they will be just as happy in the acknowledgments as they will in the story itself. So as we are thinking about this honesty prerogative that, first of all, is not a preference, it's a promise, the most important thing to remember is the honesty comes from you. It just also extends to others. If it doesn't come from you first, you will never open it up to anyone else. We cannot write others' truth. We can only write our own. Okay, as you are working through your memoir, I know this is easier said than done. Sometimes we have these internal drives that really can feel a little bit selfish. It can feel like we are isolated or siloed. It can feel like we will never reach the people we want to reach. But it's just as terrible a feeling to feel as though you have completely lost yourself in trying to cater to everybody else's personal preferences. What we have to do is we have to balance the two prerogatives. We have to balance the idea of serving our audience with the idea that we are really writing for ourselves, our own experience, and our own truth. I would love to help you with this. If you are struggling with your memoir, please reach out. Let me know how I can help. I would love to support you on this book journey that I know is going to be so rewarding for your audience and for you. Happy writing. You know what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And this is exactly what holds so many people back on their memoir projects. That is exactly why we created the Memoir Method Checklist, a full, complete list of every single step you need to take to get that memoir written, published, and marketed successfully. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.